The little girl stood silently beside a silver serving tray, her tiny hands trembling as she admired the beautiful pastries she had never tasted before. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't asking for anything. She was only looking, yet one cruel sentence echoed across the luxurious ballroom, loud enough for every wealthy guest to hear. "Look at her cheap clothes." "Who even let the maid's daughter into this party?" Laughter spread through the room like wildfire. The child lowered her eyes, fighting tears that had become far too familiar for someone so young. But hidden among the crowd was a billionaire whose next decision would change not only the girl's life, but expose the true value of every person standing in that room. Before we begin, if you believe kindness is worth more than wealth, and that everyone deserves a second chance regardless of where they come from, please like this video, leave a comment. Share it with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories that touch hearts around the world. The annual Hartwell Foundation Gala was the most prestigious event in the city. Politicians, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and business leaders traveled from across the country to attend the extravagant evening hosted inside the magnificent Hartwell Grand Palace Hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars above polished marble floors, while a live orchestra filled the air with elegant music. Every guest wore designer gowns or perfectly tailored tuxedos, and every conversation seemed to revolve around fortunes, investments, and influence. Among the dozens of employees quietly making sure everything ran perfectly was Elena Morales, a widow who had worked as a housekeeper for the Hartwell family for nearly 12 years. She had never complained about the long hours or the exhausting workload. Her only dream was simple. She wanted her 6-year-old daughter, Sophia, to have opportunities that life had never given her. That evening presented an unexpected challenge. The babysitter Elena had arranged canceled only an hour before her shift. She desperately called neighbors, friends, and relatives, but no one could help. Missing work meant risking the job that paid for Sophia's school supplies, rent, and groceries. With no other choice, Elena dressed Sophia in her cleanest lavender dress, one she had carefully stitched together from donated fabric months earlier. Although the dress was spotless, its faded material and handmade stitches couldn't compete with the luxury surrounding them. Before entering the ballroom, Elena knelt beside her daughter and gently brushed back a loose curl. She reminded Sophia to stay near the service hallway, not to touch anything, and promised that once the event ended, they would stop for hot chocolate from the small cafe that stayed open late. Sophia smiled brightly. To her, the palace looked like something from a fairy tale. Everything sparkled, everything felt magical. She had never seen flowers arranged so beautifully or tables decorated with so much food. She wasn't jealous. She was fascinated. While Elena cleaned guest suites upstairs between assignments, Sophia quietly waited near the catering station, coloring inside an old notebook. Several kitchen staff smiled warmly whenever they passed. One elderly chef secretly slipped her a warm dinner roll fresh from the oven. She thanked him with such sincere gratitude that it made him smile for the rest of the evening. Hours passed peacefully until the arrival of Vanessa Sterling. Vanessa was engaged to Ethan Hartwell, the only grandson of billionaire businessman Richard Hartwell, founder of the Hartwell Empire. Vanessa loved expensive jewelry, luxury brands, and public attention. She enjoyed reminding people how privileged she was. To many guests, she appeared graceful. To employees, she was feared. She rarely remembered names. She rarely said thank you. She believed status determined a person's value. As photographers captured her entrance, conversations shifted toward her dazzling diamond engagement ring. She smiled proudly, enjoying every camera flash. Moments later, while guests gathered around the champagne fountain, Sophia slowly wandered closer to admire the beautifully prepared appetizers. Her eyes focused on tiny fruit tarts, delicate pastries, and colorful vegetables shaped into flowers. She wasn't reaching for them. She simply watched with childlike wonder. Vanessa noticed her almost instantly. At first, she frowned. Then she glanced toward several wealthy socialites standing nearby. An opportunity to entertain them appeared. She walked directly toward the little girl. Without lowering her voice, she laughed. "Look at her cheap clothes." "The maid's daughter thinks she belongs with the guests." Several people chuckled awkwardly. Others looked away. No one wanted to challenge the future Mrs. Hartwell. Sophia instinctively grabbed the edge of her worn dress. She suddenly became painfully aware of every stitched patch her mother had sewn with love. She lowered her head. Embarrassment filled every corner of her small heart. The ballroom suddenly felt enormous. She wished she could disappear. A few catering staff exchanged uncomfortable glances, but speaking against Vanessa could easily cost them their jobs. Even the orchestra seemed quieter. At that exact moment, an older gentleman stepped through the ballroom entrance. Very few people noticed him immediately because he wasn't surrounded by security or cameras. He preferred arriving unnoticed. Richard Hartwell had built one of the country's largest business empires from a tiny repair shop started over 50 years earlier. Despite his enormous wealth, he never forgot growing up in poverty. His father had worked 3 jobs. His mother cleaned wealthy families' homes. Richard remembered watching people judge her because of her uniform. Those memories never left him. As he crossed the ballroom greeting employees by name, he noticed something unusual. Silence, fear, and one little girl trying not to cry. He watched from a distance before anyone realized he had entered. He saw Vanessa smiling proudly after humiliating the child. He saw wealthy guests pretending nothing had happened. He saw Sophia quietly wiping away tears without making a sound. Richard slowly walked toward the serving table. Every conversation stopped. Vanessa immediately straightened her posture. She assumed he had come to welcome her. Instead, Richard ignored every executive, every politician, every celebrity standing nearby. He stopped directly in front of Sophia. Then he smiled. Not the polite smile reserved for business meetings. The genuine smile of a grandfather. He gently knelt until he was eye level with her. Without saying a word for several seconds, he carefully adjusted the ribbon that had slipped from her hair. The room watched in complete silence. Richard finally asked whether she liked the pastries. Sophia nodded shyly, but admitted she had never seen food decorated so beautifully before. Her honesty struck him deeply. He picked up one small fruit tart from the serving tray and placed it onto a dessert plate. Then another, then another. Soon the tiny plate held a beautiful selection prepared especially for her. He invited her to sit beside him at the head table. Gasps spread across the ballroom. The head table had always been reserved for honored guests, board members, and distinguished donors. Never once had an employee's child sat there. Vanessa forced an uneasy smile. She assumed Richard would eventually realize the mistake. Instead, he personally pulled out a chair for Sophia. Only after the child sat comfortably did Richard take his own seat beside her. Photographers instinctively raised their cameras. Richard politely asked them to lower them. "This moment isn't for headlines," he quietly said. "It's for humanity." Those nearby heard every word. An uncomfortable silence followed. Richard asked Sophia about school. She proudly described her favorite books. She loved reading because stories allowed her to visit places her family could never afford to travel. She dreamed of becoming a doctor someday because hospitals had cared for her father before he passed away. She wanted other families to have hope when they felt helpless. Richard listened carefully. Not pretending, actually listening. Across the ballroom, Elena finally finished her assignment upstairs and hurried toward the service area. She immediately sensed something was wrong. Employees looked nervous. Some refused to make eye contact. One waitress quietly explained what had happened. Elena's face turned pale. She rushed toward the ballroom expecting to find her daughter crying alone. Instead, she froze. There sat Sophia beside Richard Hartwell himself, happily eating tiny pastries while the billionaire listened to every word she spoke, as though nothing else in the world mattered. Tears immediately filled Elena's eyes. She tried to apologize for bringing Sophia. Richard gently stopped her. He thanked her. Confused, Elena couldn't understand. Richard explained that her daughter had reminded everyone in the room what true dignity looked like. Expensive clothes couldn't buy kindness. Luxury couldn't replace character. Money meant nothing if it created arrogance instead of compassion. Many guests lowered their eyes. Some felt ashamed. Others quietly applauded. Vanessa remained frozen. For the first time that evening, she realized every camera in the ballroom had turned away from her. Attention no longer belonged to diamonds. It belonged to humanity. Richard slowly stood and addressed every guest without using the prepared speech waiting on the podium. He shared memories of his own childhood. He described watching his exhausted mother scrub floors in homes far grander than the ballroom surrounding them. He confessed that many people had looked at her exactly as some had looked at Sophia that evening. Then he asked a simple question. If we judge a child by the price of her clothes, what exactly have our fortunes purchased? No one answered, because no one could. The silence itself became the answer. That night, many wealthy guests drove home inside luxury cars carrying something far heavier than expensive gifts. They carried guilt. They carried reflection. They carried the realization that success without kindness is simply another form of poverty. In the days that followed, Richard made another decision no one expected. Instead of quietly forgetting the incident, he invited Alina and Sophia back to his office. Not because they needed charity, because he believed they deserved opportunity. He established a scholarship fund in Sophia's name that would support children of hotel employees who dreamed of pursuing higher education. He also announced leadership training focused not on customer service, but on respect, dignity, and empathy for every employee and every guest who walked through Hartwell Properties. The story quickly spread throughout the city, but surprisingly, newspapers didn't focus on the billionaire. They focused on the little girl whose quiet dignity reminded thousands of people that kindness speaks louder than cruelty ever can. Years later, guests visiting the Hartwell Grand Palace would notice a framed photograph hanging near the entrance. It wasn't a picture of celebrities. It wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It showed a billionaire sharing dessert with a little girl wearing a simple lavender dress stitched together by her loving mother. Beneath the photograph rested a single sentence. Character is the finest clothing anyone will ever wear. If this story has touched your heart so far, please write this in the comments. Kindness is true wealth. We'd love to see how many people still believe compassion can change the world. As time passed, Sophia never forgot that painful evening or the extraordinary kindness that followed it. She grew into a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence rather than pride. The scholarship opened doors, but it was her determination that carried her through them. Alina continued working with dignity until retirement, knowing her sacrifices had been worthwhile. Richard Hartwell often said that among all the investments he had ever made, believing in one little girl had produced the greatest return. It wasn't measured in money, but in hope. The guests who had witnessed that unforgettable night also carried its lesson into their own lives, treating the people around them with greater respect. Whether they wore designer suits or simple uniforms. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with speeches or headlines, but with one act of compassion in a room full of silence, the morning after the gala. The story spread throughout the Hartwell empire faster than anyone expected. Employees whispered about it in hotel kitchens, housekeeping closets, executive offices, and loading docks. Every version of the story ended the same way. The billionaire had ignored the wealthy elite and chosen to honor the little girl everyone else had overlooked. For many workers who had spent years feeling invisible, it was more than just a touching moment. It felt like justice. But while thousands admired Richard Hartwell's decision, one person could not accept what had happened. Vanessa Sterling woke up furious. Every social media post from the gala seemed to mention the mysterious little girl in the lavender dress, instead of her dazzling engagement ring. Reporters who had planned to publish articles about fashion and celebrity guests were suddenly writing about compassion, humility, and the billionaire's unexpected gesture. She felt humiliated. In her mind, Richard had embarrassed her in front of the city's most influential people. Instead of reflecting on her actions, she convinced herself that Alina and Sophia had manipulated the situation. She marched into Ethan Hartwell's office demanding that something be done. She insisted that employees should never bring their children to luxury events. She argued that Richard had weakened the family's image by placing ordinary people above distinguished guests. Ethan listened quietly. The more Vanessa spoke, the more uncomfortable he became. Until that night, he had always excused her arrogance as confidence. Now he wasn't so sure. He remembered seeing tears in Sophia's eyes before his grandfather stepped in. He remembered hearing the laughter. Most painfully, he remembered doing absolutely nothing, That realization haunted him. For the first time in years, Ethan questioned the kind of man he was becoming. Meanwhile, Alina returned to work expecting whispers, criticism, or perhaps even termination. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Employees from every department greeted her with smiles. Bellhops congratulated her. Chefs hugged Sophia whenever she visited after school. Security guards proudly saluted the little girl. Even guests who had attended the gala began recognizing Alina. Many thanked her for raising such a respectful daughter. She felt overwhelmed, not because of attention, because after years of being ignored, people were finally seeing her. Days later, Richard invited the executive board to an emergency meeting. No one knew why. The atmosphere inside the conference room was tense. Richard entered carrying a thin folder. Without wasting time, he placed it on the polished wooden table. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Everyone had come from hotel employees. Some had worked for Hartwell Hotels for 20 years. Others had joined only months earlier. Many described feeling invisible despite their dedication. Several admitted they had witnessed guests insulting staff but stayed silent out of fear. Richard looked around the room. He said wealth had built magnificent buildings. But respect built lasting legacies. If employees feared humiliation more than failure, leadership had already failed them. He announced sweeping changes across every Hartwell property. Mandatory dignity training would become part of management education. Anonymous reporting systems would protect employees from abuse. Outstanding workers would receive scholarships for their children. Promotion decisions would include kindness, leadership, and integrity, not just financial performance. Some executives applauded immediately. Others quietly wondered how such soft policies could benefit business. Richard simply smiled. He had learned decades earlier that companies flourish when people feel valued. Several months later, customer satisfaction reached record highs. Employee turnover dropped dramatically. Applications to work for Hartwell Hotels nearly doubled. Kindness, it turned out, was good business. One afternoon, Richard visited Sophia's elementary school without announcing himself. He didn't arrive with cameras or reporters. He simply wanted to keep a promise. Earlier, Sophia had mentioned loving books but having very few at home. Richard walked into her classroom carrying several large boxes. Inside were hundreds of brand new books, not only for Sophia, for every student. Children surrounded the boxes with excitement. Many had never owned books outside their school textbooks. Richard watched their faces light up with joy. It reminded him of receiving his very first library card as a boy. That single opportunity had changed his future. Now he hoped these books might change someone else's. Sophia carefully selected one about famous doctors. She held it against her chest as though it were treasure. Richard noticed. He quietly asked the principal to arrange a mentorship program, connecting students with professionals in careers they dreamed about. Within months, firefighters, nurses, engineers, artists, and scientists regularly visited the school. Dreams that once seemed impossible suddenly felt real. Meanwhile, Vanessa's relationship with Ethan continued falling apart. The incident at the gala refused to disappear. Every charity event brought questions. Every interview included references to compassion. Every conversation reminded Ethan of the values his grandfather represented. One evening, Ethan visited Richard privately. He admitted something that weighed heavily on his heart. "I failed." Richard looked at him patiently. Ethan confessed that while Vanessa mocked the little girl, he had remained silent. He realized silence often protects cruelty. Richard nodded slowly. He explained that courage rarely appears during comfortable moments. It reveals itself when speaking up carries a cost. The important question wasn't whether Ethan had failed. The important question was what he intended to become afterward. Those words stayed with Ethan. Weeks later, he made the most difficult decision of his life. He ended his engagement with Vanessa, not because of public pressure, not because of damaged reputation. Because he finally understood they believed in completely different values. Vanessa left the Hartwell family furious, convinced everyone had betrayed her. Years later, people would barely remember her name, but they would never forget Sophia. Life slowly became brighter for Alina and her daughter. They moved into a modest but comfortable apartment. Sophia continued excelling in school. She volunteered at community clinics during weekends. Every Christmas, she insisted on helping distribute gifts to children whose families struggled financially. Whenever someone praised her generosity, she smiled and said her mother had taught her that kindness costs nothing but changes everything. Richard often attended these community events quietly. He never sought recognition. Watching Sophia grow reminded him why success should always create opportunities for others. As the years passed, Sophia graduated at the top of her class. The Hartwell Scholarship covered her university education. Medical school followed. The journey wasn't easy. There were sleepless nights, impossible exams, moments of doubt, and heartbreaking days inside hospital wards. Whenever exhaustion threatened to defeat her, she remembered the little girl standing beside that silver tray. She remembered believing she wasn't good enough because of her clothes. Then she remembered the elderly billionaire who had looked beyond appearances. His faith became her strength. Nearly 15 years after the gala, Hartwell Medical Center hosted the opening ceremony for a new pediatric wing. Doctors, philanthropists, nurses, and community leaders gathered for the celebration. Richard Hartwell, now much older and walking with a cane, arrived quietly. His health had declined, but he insisted on attending. As the ceremony began, the hospital director invited the newest head pediatrician to the stage. A confident young doctor wearing a white coat stepped forward. It was Sophia. The audience erupted into applause. Many guests had no idea who she was. Richard smiled before anyone announced her story. He already knew. Sophia began her speech by thanking her mother. She described Alina as the strongest person she had ever known, a woman who sacrificed comfort every single day so her daughter could dream. Then Sophia turned toward Richard. Her voice trembled. She said there had been one evening when a frightened little girl believed expensive clothes determined human worth. One man's kindness changed that belief forever. She explained that she had dedicated her career to treating every child with equal dignity, whether they arrived wearing designer shoes or worn-out sandals, because illness never cared about wealth. Neither should compassion. By the time she finished speaking, very few people in the room had dry eyes. Richard slowly stood. Leaning on his cane, he walked onto the stage. Without saying a word, he embraced Sophia like family. The audience rose together in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. No cameras captured the most meaningful part. As they hugged, Richard quietly whispered that he had always known she would change the world. Sophia smiled through tears. She answered that he already had. Months later, Richard Hartwell passed away peacefully. The nation remembered him as a brilliant businessman. Employees remembered him as a leader. But Alina and Sophia remembered him as something even greater, a man who saw dignity where others saw poverty. At his memorial service, thousands attended. Executives delivered speeches. Government officials praised his achievements, but the words people remembered most came from Dr. Sophia Morales. She stood before the crowd wearing the same lavender ribbon her mother had saved from that childhood dress. Holding back tears, she said wealth builds skyscrapers, but kindness builds generations. One act of compassion had echoed through her entire life, because one billionaire chose to protect a crying child instead of protecting someone's pride. After the ceremony, visitors walked through a memorial exhibit celebrating Richard's legacy. Near the exit stood a simple glass display. Inside rested a tiny, carefully preserved lavender dress. Beside it was a silver serving tray identical to the one from that unforgettable evening. The plaque beneath read, "Never measure a person's future by the clothes they wear today." Sometimes greatness arrives dressed in humility. Visitors stopped there longer than at any other exhibit. Many quietly wiped away tears. Parents hugged their children. Business leaders reflected on their own behavior. Young people left inspired to treat others differently, because they realized that life-changing moments often begin with ordinary choices. A choice to speak instead of remaining silent, a choice to defend instead of mock, a choice to see someone's heart instead of their appearance. Before this story ends, we have one special request. Please comment, "Kindness is the greatest inheritance." We'd love to read your thoughts and spread this message of compassion together. The little girl once mocked for her cheap clothes grew into a woman who saved countless young lives. The maid who feared losing her job gained the respect of an entire community. The billionaire who never forgot his humble beginnings proved that true greatness isn't found in bank accounts or luxury estates, but in lifting others when the world tries to push them down. And perhaps somewhere today, another child wearing patched clothes is waiting for someone to believe in them. May we all choose to be that person. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows these meaningful stories to reach millions of people, reminding the world that kindness is never wasted. And sometimes, a single act of compassion can change generations forever.